The silence of the world, when it finally fell, was the heaviest thing of all. It was not a quiet peace, but a dead weight, a silence filled with the ghost echoes of the last bombardment. It was the silence of a landscape that had nothing left to say, nothing left to feel. In the heart of this unfeeling world, the men of Sergeant Davies' squad moved as little more than silhouettes against the pre-dawn gray. Their boots, caked in the thick, grasping mud of the Somme, made soft, sucking sounds with every step, a miserable and unending rhythm that was both heard and felt. The air, cold and damp, was a blend of metallic gunpowder, the deep, earthy smell of wet soil, and something sickly sweet beneath it all. It was the scent of rot, of a landscape giving up its dead. Among them was James, as in Jim O'Connell, a carpenter turned soldier. He walked with a slight, almost imperceptible list to the left, a constant leaning against the invisible pressure of the world. At 25, the life had already been leached from his bright blue eyes, replaced by a weary grayness that seemed far too old for his face. He was a wiry man, all sharp angles and thin muscle, a strange silhouette of a builder now tasked with demolition. He still carried the faint scent of sawdust beneath the stench of the trenches, a memory of a time when his hands had created instead of destroyed. He had joined this war with the quiet hope of earning enough to build a home, a tangible structure to shelter his love for Eleanor. His mind was a quiet place of observation, always a little apart from the loud bravado of the other men. As he walked, he could not stop himself from noticing the small details, the way the barbed wire glistened with the dew, the broken skeleton of a wagon wheel jutting from the mud like a hand begging for release. His mind, trained for precision, saw only a world of chaos and broken promises. Sergeant Tom Davies led their grim procession, a man of 42, whose Welsh origins were betrayed by the rolling warmth of his voice, now a thing rarely heard. His face was a roadmap of scars, the most prominent a deep one that ran across his right cheek, a memento from a mining collapse long before this war began. The scar was as tough and unyielding as the man himself, a symbol of his ability to survive. Tom was a man of cold practicality, a miner who knew the earth would take what it was owed, and that sentiment was a luxury no one could afford here. He walked with a heavy, resolute tread, his gaze fixed on the unseen horizon, his whole being focused on the mission. He was the voice of duty, a voice that had learned to push down the fear and the grief. Just behind them, Artie Finch stumbled. At just 19, he was the youngest, his face still round and soft beneath the thin, patchy fuzz of a nascent beard. He wore wire-rimmed spectacles that were perpetually smudged and crooked on his nose, a symbol of a vulnerability he could not hide. Artie had enlisted from London with the naive idealism of youth, a boy who had once imagined this war as a grand adventure. But the reality of the trenches had stripped that from him. He was a boy soldier now, a figure of constant, trembling anxiety. The sound of a distant gunshot made him flinch, and he had a habit of nervously picking at the fraying cuff of his uniform, a tic that spoke of an unrelenting inner terror. He ate little, and the uniform hung loosely from his frame, a stark visual of the way the war was consuming him. They moved toward a singular point in the darkness, a bridge over the River Somme. It was a simple structure, a wooden trestle bridge, unassuming in its design, but its presence here was a tactical anomaly. German supply lines still ran along this section of the river, and the bridge was a vital artery they had not yet been able to sever. The orders were simple, brutal, and clear. Set the charges, blow the bridge, and cut the artery. For Jim, the task was a bitter irony. His hands, which had once measured lumber to build a foundation, would now plant explosives to tear one apart. The march was a slow, agonizing crawl through the fog. The air grew thicker with the mist rising from the river, a blanket that muffled all sound and reduced the world to a small, isolated circle of existence. The only things that felt real were the cold seeping through his boots and the heavy, humid weight of the air that carried the constant smell of rot. The men kept their movements minimal, their rifles held close, the cold metal a familiar presence against their skin. The tension was a living thing between them, a string pulled so tight it hummed. They knew what lay in the silent spaces of no man's land, the unseen tripwires, the unexploded shells, the silent, watchful eyes of the enemy. Every breath was held, every step a calculation against the odds. As they drew closer, Jim could just make out the dark silhouette of the bridge through the dense fog. It was a simple thing, planks and beams, a man-made testament to connection and passage. The thought made a cold wave of sadness wash over him. In a world defined by its barriers, here was a thing built to bring people together, and his mission was to turn it to splinters. He ran a hand over the rough wood of a loose plank as he crept onto the structure. The coarse texture, a tactile echo of the carpentry tools he had traded for a rifle. He imagined a time when a man might have walked this bridge to bring his children home from school, or to take his sweetheart to the market in the next town. The war had taken all that away, replacing it only with the cold mathematics of strategy and the desperate, primal language of survival. The sergeant gave a low order, his voice a gravelly whisper. They were to move under the bridge now, to set the charges in a way that would bring it down swiftly and completely. Jim felt a grim finality to it all as he slid down the bank and under the structure. He could feel the clammy kiss of the wet earth against his wool trousers, the slick of mud and slime on his hands as he braced himself against the beams. The smell here was different, heavier, a mixture of wet wood, river silt, and something else he couldn't quite place. It was then, in that moment of silent, methodical preparation, that he heard it. It was a sound that had no place in this dead landscape, a sound that brought the world back to life in a way that both terrified and thrilled him. A quiet, broken whisper. It was the sound of humanity.
The sound was so impossibly soft, so out of place in this world of mud and misery, that for a moment Jim wondered if the war had finally stolen his mind. It was a faint, watery cry, like a broken echo of a sound he had not heard in years. He froze, his hand hovering over the cold, clammy metal of the explosive charge he was meant to be setting. Behind him, Sergeant Tom Davies, a man for whom an order, was already on his knees, working with grim efficiency. But then Tom stopped too. A collective stillness fell upon the squad, a stillness born not of a shared plan, but of a shared and profound disbelief. The only sound now was the low, gentle lapping of the river Somme against the wooden piles that held the bridge aloft. They had been taught to expect only death in this no-man's land, to see it in the ghostly shapes of blasted trees and the mangled skeletons of forgotten vehicles. But this sound, this tiny, fragile whisper of life, was a violation of everything they knew to be true. It came from beneath the bridge itself, from the dark, cramped space where the muddy riverbank met the structure's foundation. Jim crept forward, his rifle held high, and peered into the darkness. There, huddled together like a family of field mice, were the people. They were half hidden by shadows and the thick, wet beams of the bridge, a tableau of terror and hope. He saw a boy with wide, dark eyes, no more than 8 years old, clutching the hand of a girl who looked even younger. And with them, an old woman, her white hair pulled back into a tight bun, her face a road map of hardship and worry, but with eyes that held a defiant, untroubled light. Isabelle Moreau, he would come to learn. A tremor of a confession, a silent argument passed through the squad. Sergeant Davies approached, his face a mask of ironclad duty. He had his orders. The bridge was to be destroyed. Jim's mind raced, a frantic conflict of his past and present selves. The carpenter, the builder, saw only a family in peril, a structure that was protecting them from the storm outside. The soldier saw the explosive charge in his hand and the urgent cold logic of his mission. His hand trembled. He could not bring himself to plant the charge with human beings huddled just feet away. Tom's low, rumbling voice filled the small space, a mix of command and weary exasperation. He questioned Jim's hesitation, reminding him that the objective was paramount, that 1,000 lives would be lost if they didn't stop the enemy advance. The lives of a few unknown villagers could not be allowed to jeopardize the mission. But Jim's gaze was fixed on the young boy, Lucien, whose large dark eyes mirrored his own fear, and on the small girl, Marie, who had buried her face in the woman's lap. He insisted that they could not, would not blow up the bridge with this family under it. There had to be another way. He spoke of the humanity they had lost, of the futility of it all. What was the point of winning this war if they had to sacrifice every last piece of their own souls to do it? Artie, the young soldier who was a bundle of nerves and anxiety, agreed with Jim in a shaky, hushed tone. He couldn't bear the thought of killing them. He saw his own sister in the small, trembling girl. The young man pleaded with Sergeant Davies, his voice breaking with fear. Even hardened Tom saw the fear in the faces of his men, and for a fleeting, agonizing moment, the cold, pragmatic soldier became a man again, a man who had left a family of his own behind. He grunted an acknowledgement, a grudging concession that they had a few minutes. Not long, but a few minutes to decide. Isabel's voice, a surprisingly clear whisper in the damp darkness, broke the tense silence. She told them they were just a small group, remnants of a village bombed to nothing, seeking refuge in the only place that had offered any. She had heard the men, heard their movements, but had seen the kindness in their eyes when they discovered her and her grandchildren. She said they knew the risks. They would understand if the men had to do their duty. She gave them her permission to destroy their only protection, a quiet act of immense sacrifice. It was an offer that made Jim's resolve solidify. The old woman's quiet heroism was an affront to their own mission of destruction. He felt a deep, powerful need to protect this small, fragile spark of human life. This was not a tactical objective. This was something tangible, something real. He told Tom that he would not blow up the bridge. They would defend the family. A low, guttural order from Sergeant Davies, a sigh of resignation and duty. He would give them a few minutes, but warned them that this was their funeral. There would be no glory in this, only death. The men positioned themselves, their rifles ready, their backs pressed against the rough, cold wood of the bridge. The smell of the river mixed with the metallic odor of their fear. The quiet, broken cry from under the bridge, the one that had stopped them in their tracks, had been replaced by a new sound, the low, vibrating hum of a German patrol approaching in the distance. The clock was ticking. Their mission had changed. They were no longer soldiers tasked with destruction, but guards of an impossible promise. The bridge and the lives under it were now all they had left to protect.
The ticking of the clock was the only thing that felt real. It was a silent, frantic beat in the back of Jim's mind, counting down the seconds they had left. The low, guttural roar of a German patrol grew closer, a sound that vibrated not just in the air, but in the ground itself, traveling up through the cold mud and into their very bones. The men held their positions, pressed against the cold, rough wood of the bridge. The smell of the river mixed with the metallic odor of their fear. There were no more words, just the hard, strained breathing of men waiting for a fight they were not meant to win.
The patrol emerged from the fog like ghosts, their silhouettes sharp and menacing. A single shot rang out, a sharp crack that shattered the dense silence. It was the starting gun for a chaotic, frantic dance of survival. The air filled with the frantic buzzing of machine gun fire and the smell of cordite, a bitter, chemical scent that stung the nostrils. Jim fired his rifle, the kick of the stock against his shoulder a familiar, perfunctory violence. The flashes from the enemy's rifles were bright, sudden blossoms of orange and red in the gray landscape. He could hear the desperate, ragged cries of the Germans as his own men returned fire. The fight was a blur of frantic motion, a microcosm of the war itself, violent and fleeting. Then there was a sound that cut through the chaos, a sudden, high-pitched gasp. Jim turned his head just in time to see Artie Finch, stumble. A dark spot bloomed on his thin uniform, a red flower on a gray canvas. The wire-rimmed glasses slipped from his nose and fell into the mud, a small, fragile thing swallowed by the filth. Artie looked at his hand, then at Jim, his round, boyish face etched with a look of pure, uncomprehending surprise. There was no pain, not yet, only the shock of a life ending. In that singular frozen moment, Jim's mind left the battlefield. He was not a soldier, and Artie was not a comrade bleeding out in the mud. He saw Artie as he was just 2 years ago, a boy in a London park, his face flushed with the exhilaration of chasing a football. He saw his bright brown eyes, unclouded by the fear of death, and the way he would laugh, a sound so open and full of joy it had once made the world feel like a better place. The image of the boy running, carefree and alive, was a stark contrast to the small, lifeless body that now lay in the mud. The shock of Artie's death hit Jim with a visceral, physical force. It wasn't just a soldier who had fallen. It was a part of him, a part of their shared innocence that had been stolen away. A wave of cold, powerful rage, a feeling more potent than any fear, washed over him. The enemy was no longer a faceless silhouette, but the force that had taken Artie's life. His grip on his rifle tightened, his knuckles white. The carpenter's hands, which once held a plane to smooth out rough wood, now held a weapon with a purpose more primal than building. The German patrol, surprised by the sudden and fierce resistance from a seemingly empty position, retreated, their forms melting back into the mist as quickly as they had appeared. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was heavy with the weight of Artie's death. The sound of his own breathing was loud in his ears. He looked at Sergeant Tom Davies, a hard, weathered man who now watched the retreating enemy with a pained look in his eyes. Tom's silence was a testament to a shared loss, a loss that spoke louder than any words. The bridge was now more than just a place to protect. It was a monument, a final stand for their lost friend. The mission had changed again. They were no longer just defending a family. They were holding a line for Artie, ensuring his sacrifice was not in vain. But they knew this was just the beginning. The low, distant hum of more enemy soldiers was already growing louder. The calm was an illusion. The real battle was about to begin.
The silence that followed the skirmish was more suffocating than the clamor of the fight itself. It was a silence filled with ghosts, with the raw, wet earth, and with the heavy, unsaid weight of Artie's death. The remaining soldiers, Jim, Tom, and 2 others, huddled with the civilians under the bridge. It was a cramped, miserable space, smelling of river silt and decay, with the constant, clammy drip of water from the wood above. The cold of the mud seeped through their uniforms, chilling them to the bone, a physical presence of their shared desolation. The low, mournful sound of the Somme River's current was a constant companion, a somber rhythm to their anxious wait. Jim sat with his back against a rough-hewn beam, his rifle across his lap. The wood felt cold and unyielding against his spine, a testament to its simple, durable purpose. His mind, however, was in turmoil, a storm of grief and regret. He looked at Isabel, the old woman whose face was a testament to survival, and at the two children, Lucienne and Marie, whose small, fragile bodies seemed impossibly out of place in this world of ruin. He felt a profound sense of futility, a crushing despair that was more powerful than any fear. He confessed to Isabel that he couldn't understand the purpose of it all. He spoke of his past, of the pride he felt in building things, in creating a home for his future wife, Eleanor. He said he had come to this war to save a world that now seemed to have no interest in being saved, and that all he had done was destroy, to become something he hated. The carpenter was now a demolitions man. The thought of it was a bitter, nauseating truth. Isabel listened, her gaze as clear and steady as a flame in the darkness. She said that his purpose was not to understand the grand design of the war, but to see the purpose in the small things. She pointed to her grandchildren. She told him that hope was not a strategic victory, but a small boy who could still smile even when he was afraid, and a small girl whose hand felt warm in hers. She told him that a man's purpose was not what his hands held, a rifle or a hammer, but what his heart held. She said that in protecting their lives, he was not just defending them, he was building a new legacy, one that would live on long after the war was over. Her quiet words were a balm to Jim's soul, a gentle light piercing the darkness of his despair. He realized that this small act of protection was more meaningful than any medal or any strategic objective. He felt the builder in him reawaken, not to construct a physical bridge of wood and stone, but to build a bridge of hope between the dead past and the living future. Their conversation was an island of calm in a sea of dread. The silence under the bridge, so recently a haven, was slowly being encroached upon. The distant rumble of artillery fire, which had been a constant low hum, grew louder. A new sound joined it, the distinct, rhythmic beat of boots on a path, the sound of a large group of men moving with deliberate speed. It was not a patrol this time, but a full-fledged force. Sergeant Davies, who had been standing guard, knelt down next to Jim, his face grim. He said there was no doubt about it. This was the final stand. He gave them the order to be ready for the end. Jim, however, felt no despair, only a quiet resolve. He looked at the children, their faces soft and innocent in the dim light, and he knew what he had to do. The builder was ready to die, but not before he made sure the foundation of his new legacy was strong enough to survive. The distant rumble that had grown in the air was now a pounding, rhythmic tremor in the earth itself. It was the sound of a force too large to be a mere patrol, a full-throated symphony of purpose and destruction. The soldiers under the bridge knew this was the end. Sergeant Davies' voice was low and gravelly, a final command that carried no pretense of hope. He said they would hold the line, not for victory, but for a last, meaningful stand. The air grew thick with a cold dread, but for Jim, a strange calm had settled in. He looked at the children's innocent, trusting faces and felt the weight of Isabel's words. The carpenter was done with destruction. It was time for a final act of building. The enemy appeared from the fog not as ghosts, but as a solid wall of gray uniforms, moving with a cold, terrifying efficiency. The air ripped with the sharp, staccato sound of machine gun fire. The first to fall was one of the other soldiers, a quiet man who had rarely spoken.
He was hit with a spray of bullets, his body a sudden collapsing heap of limbs and wool. The narrator whispered of the man's last thought, a memory of the feel of his son's small, trusting hand in his own. The battle raged, a close-quarters dance of death. The acrid smell of burnt gunpowder filled their lungs. Sergeant Davies fought with a desperate, animal ferocity, a lifetime of grim survival compressed into a few frantic moments. A grenade landed near him, its blast a blinding flash of light and sound. The narrator dove into the sergeant's mind, a quick, painful glimpse of his last thought, a memory of the warmth of his wife's hand as she had waved goodbye. The blast was a punctuation mark on his life, a final, definitive end. Jim, now the last man standing, was struck. The pain was a hot, searing flame that lanced through his side, and he crumpled against the damp, cold earth. The taste of blood filled his mouth, a metallic, coppery presence. He watched the advancing Germans, their grim, determined faces. He knew this was the end. His end. But in his mind he heard Isabel's voice, a steady whisper in the chaos, reminding him that a man's purpose was what his heart held, the builder's heart. He was a carpenter, not a soldier, and his final act would be an act of construction, not of war. With a superhuman effort, Jim pulled himself to his feet. He saw the path the Germans were taking, a direct line to the small, dark space where the family was hidden. He saw the cold, determined look in their eyes, and he knew they would not hesitate. He had to draw their attention. He had to be the bridge. He stumbled out from the cover of the shadows, a desperate figure in the fog. He fired his rifle, the last bullet he would ever shoot, a final, defiant act. His body was a visible, undeniable target, and the German machine gun fire turned to him, a storm of lead. The sound was deafening, a final, brutal chorus of destruction. He felt the bullets tear into his body, a hot, shocking violation. He fell, his vision blurring, his mind already drifting. His last thought was not of the war, not of the pain, not of the mud. It was of Eleanor, her soft, loving face, and of a small wooden house they had planned to build together, a home with a red door and a small garden. He saw the house in his mind's eye, a perfect, impossible image of hope and possibility. He fell not as a soldier, but as a builder, a man whose final act was to create, to protect a future he would never see. The Germans, their objective now clear, moved past the broken body on the ground, their boots making a steady, rhythmic thud against the planks of the bridge, a sound that quickly faded into the distance. Below the bridge, the quiet, broken sound of a child's sob was all that remained. And then a new sound, the low, calm murmur of Isabel comforting her grandchildren. They were safe. Their lives and their memories of the men who gave their lives for them were a bridge. The real war was not in the advancement of a few kilometers, but in these small human moments of choice and sacrifice. And in a world of war and ruin, Jim O'Connell, the carpenter, had left behind a legacy of hope.